Hi everyone, I'm Paul Plantinga with the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa. I'll be presenting on behalf of my co-authors a paper on responsible AI in Africa and some of the opportunities we see for policy learning. So as you may know, there's been quite significant growth in AI governance initiatives on the African continent. Many of these are quite specialized in terms of their focus on AI, so AI strategies, and even ideas related to AI regulations and AI specific regulators. Some of these instruments are also aimed at being quite adaptive, and that includes initiatives like regulatory sandboxes, as well as pilot projects and public-private partnerships. And the idea with these is that they are seen to be able to bring in some of the technical expertise and knowledge that governments don't necessarily have internally, but also to attract the resources to support implementation at a later stage and to be more responsive to the changing technology environment. From our perspective, though, there are some potential risks in these arrangements. One of them is that they reinforce some of AI's exceptional character, making them inaccessible to wider public audiences. Some of these arrangements can be quite opaque and governed by quite strict intellectual property rules. The introduction of dedicated AI policies, laws, and institutions can also increase the regulatory complexity in the wider digital governance space, which can increase enforcement costs for the regulatory authorities and also make it difficult for local smaller firms to enter these markets. They also potentially overlook existing governance expertise and institutional memory, both in digital governance but also within the sector departments. And ultimately, they're potentially quite disconnected from existing rights-based frameworks such as country constitutions, as well as legal safeguards such as around the procurement of technology in the public sector. And all of this ultimately then influences the trajectory to more responsible AI, which looks beyond the technology at the wider network of people, infrastructure, and values that shape sustainable development and use. So how can we connect some of the benefits of these more specialized and adaptive governance approaches with wider legal constitutional frameworks and governance processes so that AI adoption development is more ethical and sustainable? From our perspective then, we're suggesting that a form of institutional entrepreneurship and specifically policy learning across the wider system can be beneficial. And here the focus can be much more on gathering information on what exists and who is doing work in this space, rather than driving and pushing new practices and people into existing environments, and more of a focus on linking and facilitating connections between existing regulatory actors instead of creating new institutions. But the starting point from our perspective is developing a better understanding of the existing capabilities related to policy and legislation that could be relevant to AI governance, and then going from there. So for this paper, our analysis approach was really focused on developing that deeper understanding of what exists and that could be relevant to AI governance going forward. And we did this through a desktop review of documents, really from a legislation perspective, as well as from a policy perspective, and this was largely limited to a national sphere of government. We selected 10 African countries. 8 of them were largely from Southern and East Africa, based on previous project work we've been involved in, and then 2 from Western North Africa, and that's Benin and Egypt. So the framework that we used to guide our data collection as well as our analysis was largely based on the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI. And the reason for this is that the recommendation is grounded in developing or supporting a responsible approach to AI development and adoption, and because it also reflects quite broadly global and that includes African values to a large degree. So the framework is anchored around the policy areas outlined in the UNESCO recommendation. And then we use the OECD recommendation and some of the supporting material associated with that OECD work to flesh out many of the sub-policy areas that we use to then build out quite a detailed framework, and which we could then use to identify specific policy initiatives for data collection and analysis. So as an example from this framework, by focusing on the economy and labor section and policy area, this one is made up of a number of sub-policy areas, and economy and labor in this case has AI, industry development and regulation as a sector on its own. There's also consumer welfare and competition, which is often connected to the role of competition authorities or consumer protection legislation. There's also the use and impact of AI on the economy and labor, which looks at the nature of AI within the workforce more broadly. And then finally, we could look at the use and impact of AI in specific, more economic-oriented sectors, such as financial services, retail and wholesale, extractive industries, manufacturing, and so on. Now, the focus areas for analysis in our paper are outlined on this slide. The first is around strategy and multi-stakeholder engagement, which is largely concerned with how AI-related policy and legislation are developed and the role of different stakeholders from different sectors in those processes. The second is around human dignity and autonomy, and this is concerned with policy and legislation that shapes the relationship between humans and technology in the selected countries. The third area is under economy and labor, and specifically around consumer protection, as well as competition-related policy and regulation. The fourth area is also under economy and labor, but more focused on the financial services sector. The second last focus area is around environment and ecosystems, and the final focus area for the paper that we included was around public sector adoption of digital technologies and AI going forward. So the first focus area is around strategy and multi-stakeholder engagement. And in this case, in the development of AI strategies, we've seen quite a typical arrangement where a National Council of Experts has been responsible for the development of the strategy. In some cases, there's a suggestion of broader engagement, such as through society consultations, in the case of Rwanda, and even mutual accountability. And then, of course, in implementation, as mentioned earlier, there's a proposal for partnerships with the private sector especially, and that includes Rwanda Shared Risk Fund for government AI projects. In all of this, we feel that there's some interesting opportunities for learning what's been implemented previously, especially around the broader digital economy space. And Malawi is a good example where, in the case of the Digital Malawi project, which is a joint initiative with the World Bank, they've adopted quite rigorous transparency requirements in how public-private partnerships are implemented, including quite explicit processes for grievance redress by individuals involved in both the implementation of the project as well as beneficiaries and affected communities. At the same time, Malawi, as part of their digital government strategy, has outlined some important points related to building government capacities for ICT sourcing, which would be relevant to the oversight and implementation of any kind of public-private partnership arrangement. The second focus area is around human dignity and autonomy, and the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI provides important basis for understanding what this could mean from a practical policy and legislation perspective. And this includes, for example, a person being able to refuse interaction with an AI system and request human intervention, that accountability should always lie with a natural or legal person, and that AI systems should have no legal personality. In African countries, there's already quite extensive established legislation around electronic transactions and evidence, which is relevant to human-technology interaction. And this usually just started with the need to legally recognize electronic documents and signatures, but also interesting points such as allowing a natural person the right to correct or withdraw a data message. More recently, data protection legislation, which is often drawing quite heavily on GDPR, places similar limits on the legal effect of decisions based solely on automated data processing. And in the case of countries like Zambia and Rwanda, a little bit more explicit in terms of allowing the data subject to express their point of view and to contest decisions. Nonetheless, when we look at some of the AI strategies that are being developed, they're often giving the technology quite human-like characteristics, which could be at odds with some of the existing legislation that I mentioned a moment ago. As an example, in the Egypt policy and strategy space, in the Charter for Responsible AI, humans are in charge of making decisions, but as part of the national AI strategy, it suggests that AI decides and human implements. The next focus area for the paper was around consumer protection and competition under the economy and labor policy area. And as you can imagine, this one is characterized by a significant amount of intersection and overlap between authorities and legislation, both in terms of the vertical sectors that are involved, as well as cross-cutting legislation and policy related to technology and data. As two examples taken from the paper, the one is from Namibia, where there has been development of a national consumer protection policy, which really recognizes that the diversity of legislation and actors in the space, and that there would be some benefit in having some coordination amongst these actors and support for the implementation of consumer protection within the different sectors, supported by a central consumer protection office. The second example is from South Africa, where the Competition Commission has been quite active in the digital space, and most recently has been conducting a market inquiry on media and digital platforms. And quite significantly, as part of some discussion around the terms of reference for this market inquiry, there's been a proposal to expand the scope of the inquiry to address what's called a multiplicity of rights, beyond just the sustainability of the news media industry, but also to recognize that the sustainability of this industry impacts on other issues such as the right to freedom of expression, a right to equality, right to privacy, amongst others. The next area of interest under economy and labor policy area is the financial services sector. Here we mainly were looking at South Africa, where the Banking Association and the Credit Bureau Association have both developed codes of conduct for compliance with the Protection of Personal Information Act. And both of these codes of conduct have been approved by the information regulator. In the case of the Banking Association, it outlines quite explicit commitments to transparency, complaints procedures related to automated decision making. The Credit Bureau Association's Code of Conduct is also interesting, but more because it emphasizes that accountability primarily lies with the credit providers in relation to automated decision making. Also in the broader financial services space, there is quite established legislation regulations related to the short and long-term insurance industry, which would be relevant to AI. And this includes prohibiting discrimination based on race, age, and gender. Finally, also within the banking sector is the quite established processes and structures for model risk management, which could also be relevant to AI going forward in the sector. We then moved beyond the economy and labor policy area to look at potential lessons from environment and ecosystems. In this case, we had a specific interest in environmental impact assessments, which are quite well established in terms of the processes and procedures and principles that govern their implementation. They are particularly interesting because they seek to integrate and balance the use of relatively scientific methods and modeling with wider stakeholder consultation processes. And as part of that, they require quite significant transparency around the methods being used, as well as the predictions around potential impact, and also around helping stakeholders understand the impact assessment process and being allowed to raise objections. So as a more targeted impact assessment activity, we also looked at air quality impact assessments, which are governed by a code of practice on air dispersion modeling in the South African regulatory context. And here they include approving models that can be used for dispersion modeling, and then a requirement to give authorities sufficient information to make decisions on what the modeling has provided to them. So this emphasizes the need for transparency as well as understanding by both authorities but also wider stakeholders on what models and algorithms have been used. More broadly, looking at environment and ecosystems, there are potentially other examples that can be drawn on, and one of these is around the empowerment of local stakeholders, which the environment sector has relatively mature on. In this case, we focused on Namibia's Nature Conservation Amendment Act, which could have lessons for data governance. And specifically, it's around the community conservation governance and the establishment of conservancy committees at a local level, which aim to ensure the community derives benefits from initiatives in their area, as well as knowledge about their rights. So from a data governance perspective, our feeling is that that similar community data committees could be established to broker relationships with external technology providers and actors. The final policy area that we looked at was around public sector adoption and what lessons could be drawn on in AI governance here. And from an AI policy and strategy perspective, we are seeing various initiatives being proposed in those strategies. For example, in Rwanda, there were quite interesting proposals for training of public officials, and includes capacity building for regulators as well as users and those procuring AI technology. There are also proposals for the public sector around how these initiatives would be funded, as well as hackathons and procurement guidelines, as well as maturity assessments. And possibly most interesting is the proposal to embed an AI ethics function in government departments and agencies. Now, as an opportunity for learning, there are, of course, existing public sector frameworks and legislation in most of these countries, which could be relevant to ethical AI and sustainable AI adoption. In the case of South Africa, the public sector is governed by what's called the Batopele principles, which require openness, transparency, and processes for redress, amongst others. There's also a law on administrative justice, which gives people the right to administrative action that is fair and to written reasons for decisions that are made and that affect them. So this is also supported potentially quite importantly by access to information legislation, which can help people to get a better understanding of the reasons for decisions made in the public sector that impact them. So to start concluding, the key question driving this paper was to what extent dedicated policies and legislation are needed. But a starting point for us in answering this question is rather to ask what capabilities exist and what opportunities there are for policy learning, that could inform AI governance going forward, especially in African countries. So one of the first areas we looked at was around multi-stakeholder arrangements. And as we know, a lot of the current policy and strategy development is being driven by expert committees, but there is also quite a strong drive for public-private partnerships, which can be useful in terms of mobilizing resources and expertise. But there are risks and challenges in those, and some of the lessons from Malawi, Mozambique, and others that seem to be developing are potentially useful, and that includes ensuring transparency around partnerships, as well as building in grievance redress mechanisms and building the capabilities of public officials involved in sourcing digital technologies and contract management and in partnership management. So all of these seem to be relevant to future AI adoption. We also looked at a significant body of legislation and policy related to electronic transactions, admissibility of electronic evidence, as well as personal data protection, which many African countries have been making significant progress around in recent years. And a key question as part of that work is to what extent AI-related issues may need to be addressed more explicitly, either through amendments or regulation, or to what extent jurisprudence can provide us with guidance on the way forward. Then we looked more directly into certain verticals in terms of legislation and policy and potential opportunities from learning in what has been done in some of these sectors. The one is around consumer protection and competition, and a particular interest was around the financial services sector, where there's been quite significant amount of work, and also, for example, in banking, where there are quite established processes and capabilities around model risk management. We then also looked at the environmental space, where environmental impact assessments are quite established in terms of processes, and specifically looking at air quality modeling, where they look to balance both the more scientific parts of model management with wider transparency and process requirements for stakeholder engagement. And going further, we looked at a proposal in the Namibia context where there's potential for transferring some of the work done around community-based governance to data governance. Otherwise, they're not discussed in the paper in significant detail, or some of the emerging bottom-up initiatives being driven largely by civic technology and developer communities in many of these countries. One example is in South Africa, where some of the social enterprises are developing guidance around responsible design, digital design, and data science practices. Otherwise, also not covered in this paper, but potentially important opportunities for learning and further research are, again, around data governance and around specific entities in the space. So, for example, the National Statistical Offices, which have quite extensive experience in managing data quality specifically, and more recently that includes working with administrative data, and then also around the effectiveness of existing, especially adaptive policy instruments, such as the regulatory sandboxes, which have been used quite extensively in the fintech space. And then lastly, there seems to be a need to look at the language around AI, and we potentially can learn from other sectors in terms of how they speak about algorithms and whether there are better definitions and metaphors we can use for AI governance. And then also around international law and its influence on AI governance in African countries, and that includes, of course, the UNESCO recommendation, but also the GDPR and accession and African countries' attempts to accede to certain EU treaties like Convention 108, and then continental policy and legislation initiatives such as the Free Trade Agreement and the Convention on Cybersecurity, which have potentially important implications for this space going forward. And finally, to say thank you from myself and on behalf of the co-authors on this paper.